And hello everyone. Today I am with Ray Alex Williams. Probably many of you are familiar with his videos on YouTube. So Alex, welcome to my channel and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've also been a fan of your content for quite some time since I got into the detransition world and detransition. I think you were probably one of the first people I like ran across when I was like googling male to male detransitioners, because there's just not that many of us who are at least like out in public and doing YouTube. So yeah, I don't know. Quick backstory on me. I transitioned when I was 28 years old, and that was due to autogynephilia, which we can definitely get into. I have a lot to say on that topic, but yeah, I was also a big trans activist back when I was trans identified. So I wrote like a book about like trans philosophy and defending trans feminism. I went by the moniker like trans philosopher when I was a trans activist, and I published all these like essays on like Medium, and I was like one of these trans activists on Twitter, sort of like debating, turfs or whatever. So I've done like a total ideological shift in so many aspects of like the way I think and stuff. Not just on like the trans issue, but like kind of moving away from more what I would call like a progressive woke perspective on like many different aspects of like politics and culture and society and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of like me in a nutshell. Probably more to say there, but we can jump into wherever you find interesting.
Yeah. And how long did you live as a trans woman before you transitioned?
Before I transitioned,
No, after. After. Did I say before?
okay, yeah. So I lived as a trans woman for 8 years. I was on hormones for 8 years. So from like the age of 28 to the age of 36. So it was a good chunk of my life as like an adult, and it was very formative. And I wouldn't necessarily say it was like all bad, because it was, I had a lot of positive experiences, and I met my current wife, and we're still together. We have a happy marriage. I'm very grateful for that, and I would not have met her if I hadn't been trans identified, because she's same sex attracted, and so at the time she was looking for feminine people, I guess. And at the time, like, she was kind of understanding her own sexuality from the perspective of like pansexuality. So like she was like interested in women, but like open to dating like trans women, and that was partly ideological due to her own beliefs that like pansexuality was like the correct like way to have a sexual orientation, because it's like the most politically like woke sexuality. So I wouldn't have met her, and I started my career. So overall, it was like it wasn't bad, and I don't have like massive regrets over it either. I know some detransitioners frame their experience in terms of like a narrative of regret, but that's not exactly how I frame things. So it was more just like realizing that I was pretending like the whole passing thing, trying to pass as like female, was like, yeah, that led to all my problems basically. So it's more like coming home to like a groundedness and like my maleness, and like recognizing that like I don't have to try and get people to recognize this female persona that I had created called Rachel, and that everyone was expected to use she her pronouns in like polite corporate settings and stuff. So
Oh, actually, there's one thing I related quite a lot about pansexuality. Like many years ago, I also used to say that it was a correct sexuality to have, or that
right.
everyone should be pansexual. I don't really agree with that anymore. But you also mentioned regret, that you do not really regret your transition, and that is partially the case for me as well, right? Like I don't regret as a fact that I was living as a trans woman for 3 years, but I do regret the surgery. So a lot of the time, I think we should be separating the idea of transition regret from surgery regret, because I think those are
Right.
two very different things. I wish to go back to what you said at first, that you found my channel early on when you yourself detransitioned. Uh, because we detransitioned at a different time, right? Which year did you detransition?
Last year, like May of 2023 was when I stopped the
Right.
hormones.
So
So
May
it hasn't
2023.
hasn't been very long.
Yeah, May 2023 is actually when I uploaded my first video on this subject. That's when I first opened up about my detransition. But I detransitioned back in 2016-ish.
Oh
So
wow, wow.
I imagine must have been very different back then, because when I detransitioned, there were like no videos of this sort.
Right.
It was like almost unheard of. I really thought I was like 1 in 10 millions or something like that. Like there was something wrong with me because of that. So
Yeah.
I imagine it must feel good to hear other voices that share a similar experience. Of course, not the same experience, because I don't think any detransition experience is the same, but there's
Right.
quite an overlap a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, when I was trans identified, right up until the detransition, it was almost like not even like a conceptual possibility in my mind, just because I didn't have a possibility model. I just assumed that like this is just like my path. I'm just like I like didn't really see detransition as like a viable pathway, because it just never occurred to me that it was like something that you do, because I just never heard of detransitioners. It was just always this like boogeyman of the trans activists, just sort of just constantly reiterate this narrative. It's like, oh, it's rare, and the only reason people do it is because of transphobia or financial reasons, or because society is like too transphobic or whatever. But it wasn't until my wife started doing more research into gender critical stuff and exposing herself, outside of our woke, trans activist bubble that we had both been in for, she had been in that bubble like much longer than I had, back since shoots in like high school. So she started watching, Gender the Wider Lens, the podcast, started watching Benjamin Boyce, and I sort of just started like, tagging along and listening in. I was sort of like internalizing this, and it was being exposed to these detransition narratives that gave me a possibility model for that. And so insofar as like a lot of trans people report that like they weren't able to conceptualize the possibility or develop a desire in actuality for transition until they discovered a trans person. It's like they sort of have these feelings, but they're not like articulated into any like concrete form until they first like, oh wow, I saw like a trans person on TV, or I encountered this trans person. It's like, oh, what is that? Like, so it gives you this new possibility model that actualizes these desires and puts it into a concrete frame. Well, I think detransition, with the rise of these detransition narratives, the fact that detransition is like more well known as like a possibility, I think it's going to give rise to a similar sort of, to borrow a phrase, like a sort of a detransition social contagion, such that people are going to sort of like see this as a viable part of like their total like gender journey, to borrow a term from the trans world. So it's like they're gonna sort of see that as like a new way to identify or whatever. So, and that's kind of my positive hope, which is why I'm like excited, for like your channel and like all these other detransitioners who are speaking out, because I think we're giving new languages and possibilities, and I think that just makes it easier to make that decision to detransition if you know that there's like a framework for doing it.
You mentioned previously, you talked a bit about the reasons why people detransition, and that trans activists, trans community are trying to frame it like the reasons for detransitions are primarily financial and transphobia and so on. But there are studies that suggest that might be the case, right? You have those stats that suggest that actual transition regret is very, very low, and most cases happen because of financial reasons, discrimination, lack of acceptance, or sometimes health problems. But what I find really interesting there is that most of the studies have been done primarily on people who have not necessarily detransitioned, but just stopped taking hormones, but they are still primarily part of the trans community. They are like part of that society. And then another study suggests results that are completely flipped, where like transphobia and financial reasons were at the bottom, whereas like transition regret and realizing that this was not the right choice for me was at the very top. But those studies have been done primarily. It included people in places such as Detrans Reddit and other like closed Detrans communities. And I'm thinking, like, those are completely different groups of people. You can't really compare these two.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. And also, when you really drill down into the demographic details, like the reasons why a female is going to detransition might be totally different than why a, like a gay male might detransition, or why an AGP might detransition, which I feel like the AGP detransitioners are like the most rare detransitioners, because I feel like, and I haven't fully understood, like this is one of my like, research questions I'm like interested in answering. And I don't know if there's really like a well researched answer out there, but like, why are AGPs so less likely to detransition compared to like the like young females who seem to be like the majority of the cohort who are making up like like the Detrans subreddit? And I think partly it just like fits into like the rapid onset gender dysphoria social contagion hypothesis, that there's something like unique about like the young adolescent female mind that's like more prone to taking on these trans identities in order to deal with things like autism, or internalized homophobia, or trauma, or like internalized misogyny, or like not wanting to be sexually objectified by men. So I feel like the like female experience is like totally separate. So like I think when people talk about like these detransition reasons, I think sometimes we sort of like lump everyone together, when I feel like each cohort is going to have like pretty different reasons. But there's this one researcher who does a lot of detransition research. His name is Kinnon MacKinnon.
Yeah,
he's
I
like
talked to him actually.
Yeah, I really like his research.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
what his research reveals is that there are actually like these identitarian or ideological motivations behind detransition that are increasing, such that it's not purely like external, because that's like what the trans activists want to say, is like we all are born with these innate gender identities, and then like you try and transition to express that gender identity, but like society pushes back on you, and so you sort of like go back into the closet basically. Whereas I think what Kinnon's research shows is that there's actually like a change at the level of identity itself, which proves that gender identity is not something you're born with. It's like a complex psychological process that gets like developed and is like influential by all these different factors, which sort of like throws a wrench in the whole like born this way, like immutable, characteristic idea, and makes it much more like amenable to these complex like psychosocial, cultural, social contagion factors, particularly for the females.
I don't see either gender or sexuality as truly set in stone. I think there are a lot of examples out there that prove otherwise. that it can be fluid and flexible in a lot of individuals. I think some people are just more open to that fluidity than others. I just think that this argument can also become it can become used as an excuse for conversion therapy, for example.
Right. Yeah. I know. Yeah. That is like tricky. And I think, you know, sort of like the idea that things like sexual orientation, for some people, like for some people, there's degrees of fluidity in the sexual orientation, but that recognizing that fluidity is like different than saying that like you can consciously force yourself to change through just like making a conscious decision to say, okay, I'm not going to be gay. I don't think that's work, even if like it's not set in stone such that, you know, upon birth, like your entire biological reality at birth is going to like 100% concretely determine your entire future sexual behavior and orientation. And there can be sort of like a primary identity, a primary sexual orientation that's like, you know, very solid and like foundational, while still like at the behavioral level, you know, there's like fluidity in like the, you know, because there's sort of, you know, and also like I think to some extent some of these like labels like, you know, straight or gay, they become sort of like identities such that, you know, there's men who are bisexual insofar as they've had bisexual sexual experiences and behaviors, but they still identify as straight. So it's like, well, are they straight? Well, like, what is straight? Is it like, is it something you identify as because of like cultural pressure, or is it like, you know, so it's sort of like we have to like tease apart all these different things. And I think, you know, some of the vocabulary, we sort of, but yeah, I don't know. I just think there's just also just like not as much research on this, but yeah.
Yeah, you know, a lot of the time I think that I don't really believe that there is such a thing as 100% heterosexual or 100% homosexual. You know, it's sort of like, well, is there an individual that is 100% autistic? Is there someone who is like 100% neurotypical? Well, if those individuals exist, there must be very, very few. Like, those are the ends of extremes. It's sort of like saying that, well, there are people with extremely low IQ and extremely high IQ, but those individuals are also very, very few, right, in comparison.
Right.
But I don't necessarily think that, like, IQ just on sort of like in the middle, where it's at its height, right? Most people are sort of average when it comes to IQ. I don't necessarily think it's the same with sexuality. I don't think most people are like typical bisexuals. But it's still interesting to me, really, because I do think sexuality can be flexible. And a lot of the time I think it happens like in someone who, let's say, they identify as heterosexual, let's say a heterosexual man. Well, one day they may meet a very, very feminine man that they might find themselves attracted to, because that man possesses the same feminine characteristics he's already attracted to. So that sort of opens the first door there. And if he's open to that and he engages in a relationship with that person, it might escalate a further interest in that. So it might also develop interest in a more masculine sexual characteristics in the future. I don't think it happens in that many individuals, but I think it's possible for some to go there.
Right. Yeah. I definitely agree with you that like things are usually more fuzzy than a lot of people assume. And one of the things that like I think the sort of move in the gender critical world to sort of really, you know, push back that sexual attraction is based on gender identity, and they sort of have these really rigid things like, okay, so lesbian means same-sex attracted, which means you can only ever, like, if you are same-sex attracted, you can only ever be attracted to female people. And so if you have any attraction to a trans woman, then like that proves that you're not a true lesbian, you're like bisexual. But In my experience, like things are a little bit fuzzier than that picture because something is always so clear cut. So when I was trans-identified, at one point I was engaged to a lesbian who is a female lesbian who was a Gold Star lesbian, had been out as gay, out as lesbian since she was like 17. She was like in her like late 30s. So she had been like decades of living as a Gold Star lesbian, never been with a male before, never slept with any penis or anything. Was very strongly in her, gay identity, had like, lesbian tattoos, was like firmly in the lesbian, subculture, like, but she was attracted to me and like, so it's like, I don't know, was she like secretly bisexual or, but it's like, I just think these things are not quite as clear cut because I think attraction, so I think people define sexual orientation relative to like attraction to sex, which makes sense from like an evolutionary perspective, because if you're heterosexual as a male, it would make sense for you to have a attraction to female so that you can propagate your genes, which is how sex evolved. But evolution also relies on the detection of femaleness via like surface level proxies, because you sort of rely on these feminine proxy markers to sort of indicate that you're female. So if you have, and I think, so the question is like, are you attracted to those proxy markers or are you attracted to the underlying sex? And I think it could be the case that sexual orientation works on both levels. You're attracted to like the sex, but you're also, the brain can be sort of attracted to these surface level markers. So if you're like a passable trans woman who's on estrogen, like I think that can sort of like hijack that like neural circuitry to basically, so I think like these things are more complicated than people recognize. So I don't know. That's sort of my hot take on that. 'Cause I know some like gender critical, like gay people will just like totally disagree with that, and but I'm not trying to like discount their experiences. I just think things in my experience are a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, no, I'm on board with you there. I think of sexuality and sexual attraction sort of like two-layered, right? Like you have the attraction based primarily on sex, and then those secondary sex characteristics or those defining traits of either femininity and masculinity, right? And that's why a lot of the time I prefer to call myself androsexual rather than gay, just stating like I'm attracted to masculinity, but it doesn't make much difference to me whether that person who encompasses that type of masculinity is a trans man, or a woman. I think that there are some very, very masculine women that I am attracted to, right? So does that make me bisexual? I used to say that in the past, but now I prefer to think of it as androsexuality. And I think there's also a spectrum to that, to both androsexuality and gynosexuality. In a way, I think the way we define sexuality is sort of like with time zones. Like we set certain time zones, right? But, they don't explain everything, those time zones, right? Because there's like this endless movement of the sun around the Earth. And, you can't really make a single category for every single millisecond the sun moves, right? So they are not that precise. I think they are helpful, but I think it lacks the sort of precision in the way we view sexuality.
Right. Yeah, and also just don't think we understand scientifically the nature of sexual orientation. Like, I think there's more research. For example, there's sort of like from like an evolutionary psychology perspective, it's a little bit of a mystery. Like, I think it still remains an unsolved scientific question in regards to like how did homosexuality evolve? Because if you're homosexual, you're less likely compared to if you're heterosexual to pass on your genes. Yet there's suggestive evidence that homosexuality has a degree of heritability. So it's like, how can something be heritable if it makes you less likely to pass on your genes? I just don't think we have a full scientific understanding of like what it is, like, which is separate from this, I think we often get stuck in these more like moral, philosophical questions like, oh, well, is it like good to be this way? Is it like bad? Is it, is it like normative or non-normative or healthy, unhealthy? Or it's like, I think like at the purely descriptive scientific level, I don't think we like fully understand it. So like, so yeah, I don't know. That's sort of also my possibly hot take. But
Yeah, I mean, it is hereditary homosexuality, but I think like straight people have so like those gay genes that can be passed on. That's what I think is happening. Sort of like you might be neurotypical, but your child may still be autistic. There is a chance of that, right? There's potential
Right.
for that in your DNA. But now, if you have one parent that is autistic, the chances of your child being autistic is significantly higher. And if both parents are autistic, then the chance of your child being on the spectrum as well is even higher than that. And I sort of think it's the same with homosexuality. Otherwise, homosexuality wouldn't really survive from a evolutionary perspective if only homosexual individuals will carry of such genes. And if that was the case, then I also think that the most homophobic societies will also be this kind of societies where homosexual individuals will thrive the most, because then they will be forced into heterosexual marriages and reproduce. So there will be more gay people in
That's very
this
interesting.
type of society, right?
Yeah. I never really thought about that, but that's like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like if we say everyone is gay these days, well, no, there were probably more gays back in the day.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah. But I want to go back to the very, very beginning of this video, because you mentioned that you were a fan of my channel for quite a long time. I don't think I had the opportunity to say thank you. And also, I've been following your channel for quite many months now. I don't remember exactly when I found your channel first, but what really caught my attention is that when I read your channel descriptions, it says both a detransitioner and philosopher. And well, I'm not sure how many detransition philosophers are there out there, but it felt like, oh wow, I'm not the only one. Yeah.
Did you study philosophy in like undergrad, or what's your relationship to like philosophy, or how, like
I did study philosophy at the University of Oslo. I technically did, well, I always finished my bachelor, but I dropped out because of addiction and depression. So I'm a college dropout, but I've been practically working on it myself. So I don't have a degree, but I sort of did a master in philosophy on my own, like completely independently. And now, well, I mostly, my interest is mostly in philosophy of technology and the consciousness, philosophy of physics, especially when it comes to time, cosmic evolution, energy density, entropy, things like that. Also, I don't know if I mentioned consciousness as
yeah,
well.
I'm super interested in the philosophy of consciousness. That was actually my specialization for like the longest time in philosophy, was like consciousness stuff. So I'm like super. We could probably have like a whole podcast episode just talking about
Let's
like
try.
consciousness and stuff. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the nature of human consciousness?
So for the longest time, when I was younger, I was a hardcore like physicalist, eliminativist, materialist, like kind of taking like the most radical position of them all, which is that like consciousness doesn't exist. Like there's no such thing as qualia. It's just like a linguistic illusion of some type or another, and that like really the only thing that exists is just physical stuff, and consciousness doesn't exist as like a separate reality at all. So there's no such thing as subjectivity or consciousness or anything like that. It's just, we just have atoms, and then the atoms are organized in like behavior, and then that's it. So it's kind of like a behaviorist, which is funny. But over time, I sort of like, I'm like a little bit more agnostic, but I think I lean now towards like almost like the opposite extreme, which is like the more sort of like idealist, panpsychist perspective. I'm not sure if you've read any of Bernardo Kastrup's stuff on like consciousness and like idealism. Basically, the idea that like consciousness is like the fundamental ontological reality, and like matter is like downstream of consciousness rather than like the other way around. So that's sort of like my perspective now, which is like, so we're kind of like living in like a like all of reality is like basically like a one big conscious dream of some kind or another.
I mean, it sounds a bit like an overlap with panpsychism. I would even call it a form of panpsychism.
Yeah, I think panpsychism is like more like, I don't know, it's hard to, these like definitions get like tricky and stuff, but it's like, I think panpsychism is like everything is conscious, whereas I think idealism is that consciousness is like the fundamental reality, and that, so it's kind of like if consciousness is the ocean, physical matter is like a wave, or like it's like a wave in the ocean essentially, such that, you know, what we recognize as like physical stuff is just like ripples in the pond of like consciousness. Whereas I think panpsychism is like there's the matter, like there's matter as like an independent level of reality, but then the matter happens to all be conscious, which is like slightly different. So it's like, it's the difference between like everything is conscious versus like consciousness is everything. I don't know, maybe that I don't know if that's helpful, but
Well, you know, from my own experience, for conversations I had with panpsychists, they would actually agree with you, from what I hear. Like a lot of the time, I would say that it's consciousness that is like the fundamental property of the universe, and everything comes to be like through consciousness.
right. Well, I always get confused on that because I hear some panpsychists say that, but it's like, it's more like consciousness is like one of the fundamental properties of reality, like, you know, mass, space, time, force, whatever, and then like consciousness is one of these other ones. But I think that the actual true idealist position is like, it's not that consciousness is like one of the fundamental forces or like dimensions of reality, but it's like pretty much like it's like the most foundational layer of reality. But that's sort of like maybe like a nitpicky like distinction.
Still sounds like a clear overlap with panpsychism to me, really, because I don't think panpsychism is a type of monism where there is just one substance. It's more like, well, if you think of pantheism, like with God, well, this sort of ideology doesn't say that everything is God, every single object that exists in the universe, but rather that God is within everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I like definitely lean more towards like that, like monist, like all is one sort of like metaphysics. Yeah. I'm very attracted to that. There's this system of Hindu philosophy called Advaita Vedanta, which is like a non-dual. I'm not sure if you've heard of that or not, but it's they actually have a very sophisticated philosophy of like consciousness that tracks with this like idealist perspective, such that essentially everything is conscious. The self is consciousness, and we're like one with everything. So it's kind of like it's very monistic. It's like non-dualistic, and I just like that because it's like very simple. It's sort of like it sort of like resolves a lot of these puzzles. So I'm like a big fan of that philosophical system.
Yeah. Well, since you like monism, what are your thoughts on Spinoza?
Honestly, I read a little bit of Spinoza in college, but I honestly didn't fully like grapple with everything, as I think he's so complicated. Like his kind of geometrical arguments and like the proposition is like, yeah, I haven't fully grappled with like his system of thought, though I kind of just hear the classic like reduction of his thought to say like God is nature and nature is God. People, think that is like, interesting. So I don't know. I don't honestly know enough about him to have any like really solid like opinion. Other than just like appreciation of the fact that he's one of like the greats or whatever.
Because like Spinoza's monism is closely tied to pantheism, right? Since Spinoza doesn't necessarily views God as a force outside of our world, but rather that is the fundamental property of the universe. Like God is the universe, and because everything comes from that sort of force, whether it's well on the surface you perceive it as either material or phenomenal, it's all the same substance, really.
Right. Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. I just need to learn more about him. I've always been fascinated, but yeah, I just haven't done that much research on him.
His book Ethics, I also think, is a good introduction to Spinoza's philosophy. But personally, I really like this thing called property dualism. I definitely consider myself a property dualist, in a sense that I consider the phenomenal and the physical as two different substances in and of itself, but not necessarily on the substantial level, but rather because of their properties. Like I think the properties of consciousness cannot really be reduced to the properties of the mind, and of the fact that we, like scientifically, still don't really understand the nature of consciousness. Like it's very possible that it's not just the brain that is the source and origin of the consciousness, but rather the overall electrical current that is going on there. So there's a lack of knowledge there, and I don't think we can reduce it purely to physicality. And I'm a big fan of David Chalmers.
Yeah,
actually.
me too. I used to like hate David Chalmers because I thought he was
because you didn't really like the concept.
Yeah, because I was like a hardcore like materialist, and I thought the hard problem of consciousness was like bullshit or whatever. I was like, oh, that's just like philosophers making stuff up. That's just like that doesn't make. But then eventually I came around, and now I agree with Chalmers that there is a hard problem of consciousness, and I don't think science is ever going to solve that gap. I think there's always going to be an explanatory gap with the physical sciences in trying to explain the nature of consciousness, mostly because it's just like a category mistake to think that you can explain the subjective in terms of the objective. It's like it's just never gonna work. So but like a lot of people think that like they can kind of like rescue their physicalism and maintain like this perspective, and everyone's trying to solve it. It's like trying to reduce it with different theories, but I do think that the dominant reign of physicalism is starting to crumble, and I think like more and more people are starting to be open to these like non-reductionistic accounts of consciousness, which I think is encouraging, and I think people are more willing to take seriously the possibility that like consciousness is not just like purely just like brain activity, but there's something more there that's like non-reducible to the physical.
I mean, the way I see it, I think that reducing the the essence of consciousness, of the phenomenal subjective qualia experience, to pure physicality is sort of like attempting to explain the appeal of music through mathematics,
Right.
right? Or to try to understand the appeal of visual art, such as painting or sculpture, uh, purely understood by geometry. Like, yes, well, the two are very, very important in creating both music and art, but you cannot really explain the so-called soul of art and music purely through mathematical processes.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. Yeah, I used to really like hate Plato. I always thought Plato was like, it's kind of like this outdated relic that no one should take seriously now that we have like modern science and stuff. Like now I kind of like over the years I've come to realize that like that kind of like Platonic idealism is probably has more truth to it than like this purely atomistic reductionism that so yeah, this idea that like music for example is just like Platonic ideal, and there's like something like almost like I hate to use the word because it's like woo woo, but there's almost something like magical to things like music that kind of tap into these like higher things that there's something like Plato's concept of like the good. It's like the good is like this highest ideal, and there's something like special or like spiritual or magical about that like can't be explained through pure machinery or whatever. So I like really resonate with that, and it's like a huge aspect of like my own like spirituality and stuff like that. Which I do think that's the other thing I've kind of changed in my approach to consciousness is like, it's why I like the Hindu approach to consciousness studies is like in the West, the approach to consciousness studies is just purely at like a intellectual curiosity knowledge level. We're trying to do like the science of consciousness, whereas I think in the Hindu perspective, the quest to understand consciousness is seen from an enlightenment or liberation perspective, such that when you understand consciousness, it has some like positive effect in your own mind, such that it brings you peace and joy and contentedness and like enlightenment to some degree or another. So there's like a spiritual liberation perspective connected to understanding consciousness, whereas I think in the West, like we don't have that perspective that it's like connected to like your own personal salvation from like the negatives of reality or something. It's just like purely objective knowledge or something. And I like that emphasis because I do think when you come to terms with the reality of consciousness, that like it just helps you deal with reality better. It makes you more calm, more content, more peaceful. Like it makes you accept yourself, makes you accept reality. So
Yeah, I think that it really depicts a big difference between Western and Eastern philosophy, and I notice a lot of the time, at least on the academic level, Western philosophy doesn't really concern itself much with Eastern. A lot of the time, it's just being reduced to pure spirituality or religion without realizing the important philosophical component of that. And yeah, I definitely think that Western philosophy lacks spirituality, and it is one of the big issues I have with Western philosophy, definitely. But I also have to disagree myself with you when it comes to Plato. I still I found Plato unappealing 10 years ago, and I still find Plato unappealing today. I mean, not everything. I think I like Plato on an ethical level, like when it comes to ethics, but as far as metaphysics ontology is concerned, I don't really subscribe to Plato's ideas. While I like some forms of dualism, I don't necessarily. I think Plato's dualism is sort of very fundamental there. You know, it's like,
Yeah,
especially when it comes
it's
to
like
the
it's
world of
more,
ideas and
yeah,
forms. It just undermines everything that does not fall into that category.
right. Yeah, and that's just because like I'm a big fan of like idealism, and like idealism and Plato like kind of go like hand in hand. So like I think it's just like, you know, different temperaments really, which something I've like come to appreciate over the years, that I think a lot of philosophy is not driven from rational argumentation in terms of like what makes people believe the philosophical ideas they do. It's more about like what are people's sort of like personality temperaments that like draws them into certain conclusions. So like it's not like I can be like, oh, like I can prove to you logically, conclusively that like idealism and Plato is like right. It's more like I think there's just some people who personality wise are like drawn to that sort of idealism, and then there's other people who like it doesn't like resonate with them. So for me, that's like I don't really think that much of philosophy is like resolvable. It's not like I can prove to you that Plato's right. It's just like I like the Plato vibes, basically. It's all vibes, basically. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. You know, I think it's a lot of the time it's also the case with politics as well. Like, how progressive, how conservative will you be? Sort of dependent on your psychological profile, right? Your temperament and your own personal preferences. And I think, yeah, absolutely, I think it's the same with philosophy. I'm not sure if I well, it depends what you mean by science, but a lot of the time I don't really consider philosophy to be a proper science in the sense that those arguments are not really based from empirical perspective, right? Unless you
Right.
truly, truly believe that everything can be reduced to pure empiricism. But even then, you are subscribing to an ideology by doing that, which is
Right.
probably very subjective and again can be reduced to your own psychological profile there. But I think, you know, a big issue with how we handle philosophy today is that we are trying to treat it in the same way as if it was a form of science, when it really,
Right.
really isn't. And I don't. I read a lot of academic papers, like practically every month. I read a couple of those, but a big issue I find with those is just how inaccessible they are to general population. Like you
Right.
need to know how to read those papers. It's sort of like
Right.
a secret code, right? So it creates sort of a secret academic elitist society. Like, oh, this is our conversations here. This is our secret club. Where I think we should be moving philosophy away from academia and
Right.
into the
Yeah.
external non-academic world, really, like making philosophy more practical, how we can use, I think, you know, I really want more philosophers to be working as advisors, and
Right.
especially as someone who has, you know, a really big interest in philosophy of technology. I think that a lot of technological development needs philosophical advisors with experience in both philosophy and technology and ethics.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you on like the academic writing style of like modern analytic philosophy is terrible. It's like, it's just like, it's obscure, it's obtuse, it's just like, it's deliberately jargony.
Yeah.
And I think it comes out of, and this idea that like, and I used to call it like like logic chopping, and like I can never write papers like that. It's like premise one, premise two, premise three, blah blah blah. It's like it's very like sort of it's like it's like formalizing it and formalizing it with like these formal notations, and I was always of the opinion that unless you're doing like pure logic, the formalization of argumentation is like not actually helpful. I think it's fully possible to articulate your argument in prose style if you are a good enough writer, and that the formalization into like distinct like premises and stuff is like more for like it's like showing off your technical abilities that are deemed to be like a necessary like skill set in the sort of like bureaucratic academic world to kind of like prove yourself or whatever. And I think it's mostly for like the professionalization of like the field has led to that as like a negative side effect rather than something that's like intrinsically a positive thing that's like helpful and clarifying. Because for me, like I look at someone like Nietzsche, who's a brilliant prose writer, wrote in aphorisms. Like his argumentation is more effective and powerful than like most of these logic choppers writing these analytical papers. For me, that was always like my ideal philosopher in terms of writing, was like Nietzsche rather than like some contemporary person who's like writing these formalized notations. I just can never do that. And one of the reasons I dropped out of my PhD program is because I just like I didn't have what it took to formalize things like that, and I just didn't like it. I was like, this is bad writing. I care about writing. I'm like a writer, so like I could not make it in the analytic world.
I mean, I relate to that 100%. And, after I dealt with my addiction and depression, I was considering going back to uni to continue studying. But I also, I didn't really like what was going on in the academia. And, of course, you make it much harder for yourself to make it as an independent philosopher, independent writer, than if you have a degree, mostly because people care about status a lot of the time, right?
Right.
But no, I absolutely agree with what you said about writing. A lot of the time, I prefer like older philosophical writings to the contemporary academic papers. They all sound the same, and 100% agree with you on the writings of Nietzsche. I think they are really interesting to read. But personally, when it comes to writing itself, my personal favorite is Spinoza. No, sorry, not Spinoza, Descartes.
Yeah.
And when it comes to Descartes' philosophy, I absolutely disagree with Descartes. I don't think there's sure, like we're both dualists, but also the way we perceive dualism and consciousness and body are sort of different. So I disagree with Descartes on a lot of things. But when it comes to the way he writes, I absolutely love it. I think those are some of the best examples in the world of philosophical writing. I like the way he explains his thought process as he goes through this, like everything is just so crystal clear, like how he arrives at the conclusions. Something I would think a lot of philosophers, and especially in like contemporary times, are completely dropping. And I think that's part that makes it more interesting, really. That's why I think
Right.
those classical philosophers, whether modern or ancient, are more appealing to general population than the
Right.
contemporary academic papers. And I really think we should go back to that style.
Right. Yeah, I am seeing an increasing trend of like more public philosophy, like philosophers like doing podcasts and YouTube channels and like more public facing social media stuff, and like the blogging world. Like when I was in grad school, I was like very involved in like the philosophy blogging scene, but I am actually really happy I dropped out. I like work in corporate now, but I feel like as an independent scholar and researcher who still considers myself to be engaged in like the enterprise of philosophical thinking, I think I have like way more freedom now to think independently and not be beholden to the political correctness and woke cancel culture that's run rampant in the academic world right now. Because take like this issue of like the gender critical feminism or philosophy, like it is still the case that you will definitely get canceled and ostracized in the philosophy world if you try and argue for a gender critical perspective. And I know for a fact that from looking at like anonymous philosophy blogs of like people in the profession, there's way more anonymous people who have gender critical positions, but they don't speak up about it, at least in public, because, you know, they don't have tenure, they're still junior, they're still, you know, and they don't want to, you know, be like a canceled or be deemed offensive or chastised or ostracized. And so whereas like now I just feel like I'm not scared of of that. I mean, obviously there's still like a concern with like, you know, I still have this kind of fear in the back of my mind that like, you know, the trans activists are gonna go after my job or something, or try and get me, you know, fired for, you know, quote unquote being transphobic on Twitter or something, or like, you know, something I said on like YouTube. But yeah, so yeah, there's still possibility of cancel culture if you are in the corporate world, you know, because the corporate world is also very politically correct. But academia, like, it's bills itself as this like, you know, freedom of ideas and like pursue the truth no matter what, but that's not the case at all. I feel like way more freedom to pursue the truth no matter where it leads like now than I ever did in like academia. So I am like 100% happy to be outside of academia. I think I'm doing way better philosophy than I ever did back then.